The first thing that we're going to be talking about today is the Victorian Era, which is the time period in which Dracula is set. The Victorian Era takes place from 1837 to 1901. You should be taking some notes during this PowerPoint, so you might want to pause it and go get a piece of paper and a pen or pencil if you do not have one. And you should note that the Victorian era does take place between 1837 and 1901. This is an important time period, and this will come up again when we talk about later texts such as Jane Eyre. The era was named after Queen Victoria, who was the ruling monarch of the time period. She became queen at 18, and she married her first cousin Albert at age 20. This was more common than you would think. Of course, there's a little bit of a gross out factor for marrying your cousin nowadays. However, back then they tended to marry cousins because they wanted to keep the royal line as pure as possible, and they wanted to keep the money within the family. They were married for 21 years, and they were a very devoted couple to one another. She went into a prolonged period of mourning after he died, and she wore black for the rest of her life, which is important for a few different reasons. Before this time period, when a husband died, the widow would have a period of mourning, and when she was done with mourning, she would most often get married again, and that is how she would have her social status and her wealth, and it was pretty unheard of for a woman to simply remain unmarried. What Queen Victoria did by not getting remarried and by, sort of becoming a widow popular was she enabled women a certain amount of freedom that they didn't have before, because after their husband died, it would be acceptable for them to remain single and not get remarried, and thus not find their identity only through their husband. The people really loved Queen Victoria. Becoming a widow became very fashionable because of her, so you'd see a lot of women wearing black for prolonged periods of time because that's what the Queen did. Her reign was a period of prosperity. The British Empire was overseas. There was the industrial improvements that were occurring at home. A large educated middle class was developing during this time period. You will see some Victorian architecture here on the bottom. You'll see some Victorian school children. Education for children was something that was occurring more frequently during this time period, and Victorian dress. You will notice that it is an extremely conservative time period. Some Victorian era developments include widespread interest in paranormal events. Again, Queen Victoria's husband passed away, so she more than likely had an interest in paranormal events. But other than that, things like hypnotism, communication with the dead, and conjuring up ghosts became very popular. It would be quite normal to go to a meeting of people who were interested in ghosts, to have seances held in someone's parlor. There were institutes and educational foundations that were set up that researched these things just like they were science. Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. In 1888, Jack the Ripper murdered and mutilated at least 5 prostitutes, so you have that going on as well. So socially, there's quite a bit. Paranormal activity, the idea of Darwinism coming up in this time period, and also one of the first very famous serial killers, and this interest in blood and gore and all that other stuff. And you see a lot of this in Dracula. There were also a lot of technological advances. The first railway, shorthand writing, the typewriter, the telegraph, the telephone, and the phonograph all occurred during this time period, and you will see many of these discussed in Dracula. Here's a phonograph. This is shorthand writing. This is referenced within the first 4 chapters. Jonathan talks about how he keeps his diary in shorthand. Shorthand is almost indecipherable to someone who has not been trained in it. It looks sort of like hieroglyphics. So if you are not trained in it, you can't read it. It's just not abbreviating things. We already talked a little bit about women in Victorian England and the fact that Queen Victoria gave them quite a bit of power and independence by remaining a widow. There was the other side of Victorian era women, and that was the great social evil of the time period, which was prostitution. It was of great concern amongst the public. There was a very large emphasis on female purity. You had a widowed queen who was very pure and chaste, and that was the ideal for the time period. And on the other side of things, you had the prostitute, which was obviously not the ideal. And it was a concern because if men slept with prostitutes, there were a lot of diseases that were going around, and they would bring these diseases home to their own families. So women and men were both concerned about this great social evil. Men could divorce women for adultery, but a woman could only divorce a man if adultery were also accompanied by cruelty. And that's not to say that divorce was common, because it was still pretty much unheard of during this time period. It was not socially acceptable at all. The ideal woman was graceful, quiet, polite, tactful, and pure. And you will be receiving a handout in class that goes through some of the things that an ideal woman in this time period should and should not do. She should not laugh loudly. She should not yell out to people. She's always supposed to listen, not be overly affectionate in public. You weren't even really supposed to hold hands. Even if you were married, holding hands in public was a little bit over the top. So you can imagine what they would think about public displays of affection nowadays. Women were considered to be biologically inferior to men. However, they were often considered morally superior. Here's another picture of some Victorian dress. This one's actually a little racy, showing a little skin there. These, believe it or not, are bathing suits. You can see they are covered up to the neck, down to the toes, full arms, and there are skirts over the pants. I'm not sure how you would be expected to swim in that, but you were. So if you take one thing away from this, think about the fact that Victorian era England was extremely prudish, extremely conservative. They did not talk about sex, they didn't write about it. It was one of the most conservative time periods.